going to kick things off. So welcome everyone to Builders Declare Australia's 8th webinar. My name is Simon Clark, one of the founders of Builders Declare and Director of Sustainable Homes Melbourne, and I will be your host for this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So we have an incredible presentation coming your way this evening, one that gets a lot of attention, titled Sustainable Timber, the Australian Facts and Solutions, to be presented by Mark Thomson, who is an independent director. I want to make that clear, an independent director of Responsible Wood. Mark's also an award-winning eco-architect with his practice based out of Brisbane, named Eco-Effective Solutions, and Mark's recently been appointed to the international judging panel at the World Architecture Festival in Amsterdam. Now, tonight's event is brought to you by Hyne Timber, who are one of Australia's largest producers of sawn timber products and an iconic supplier to the Australian construction industry. I'll play a short video in a couple of minutes that provides a great insight into Hyne and the Australian timber industry and really sets up this presentation. Now, before we get to tonight's presentation, I want to keep you all abreast of upcoming news and events with Builders Declare. Firstly, we have an awesome webinar coming up on May the 12th by one of Builders Declare's directors, Brian Gunnan of iSmart Building based out of Perth. Now, Brian's presentation is hugely valuable to those looking to build high-performing homes or a passive house, and will be focused around WRB, weather-resistant barriers. Now, Brian is incredibly qualified to talk about this subject. Not only is he a qualified carpenter and builder, but also qualified passive house tradesman, passive house designer, and he's also accredited with the Air Tightness Testing and Measurement Association as an air tightness tester. Bit of a tongue twister, but clearly Brian's well equipped to educate us all on the importance of weather-resistant barriers in high-performing homes. Also, all year, I'm sure most of you have heard me harping on about this new website that Builders Declare are creating. And that's because we understand that a declaration is not enough and we need to facilitate real tangible action. Now at Builders Declare, we have 7 extremely committed directors putting their hard-earned on the line to create what will be an incredible resource to promote and educate the Australian building industry to a more sustainable future. And we're getting closer and closer to making this a reality. Once again, I'll put the call out there. If there's anyone tuning in right now that believes in what we are doing and is in a position to help fund and make this resource happen and make Australia's construction industry the most sustainable in the world, please get in touch. You can reply to emails that you would have received for this event, or you can email us at info@buildersdeclare.com. Let's kick off tonight's event, Sustainable Timber, the Australian Facts and Solutions, presented by Mark Thomson. First of all, disclaimer, the information you're about to receive is based on the experience of the presenter and may not relate to you or your situation. If you'd like more specific advice, please get in touch with us via email. Mark's presentation will run for around 45 minutes. We'll save 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen for questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot, as I have experienced last time. I'll stop talking now. I will put that link to that video in the chat and take it away, Mark.
Great, thanks Simon, and thank you Builders Declare for the opportunity to give this presentation. I am an Australian architect based here in Brisbane, And I'm actually a member of, or a signatory to Architects Declare as well. So it's really great to have this opportunity to talk to you, because I believe there's a lot of synergy that exists between both groups. What I'm keen to do today, and I'll just get the screen up and running. All right. So the topic of my talk is Australian facts and solutions for the future. Now, this presentation is being put together in the context of my role at Responsible Wood. I'm an independent director there, but this information has come together from a number of sources that I've been able to grab through the timber industry, and in fact, most of the information that I'm putting forward is what I call third-party information. So hence, I'm presenting it to you in the way that I have found it. And I hope this to be a presentation which is hopefully informative and hopefully gives you some insights as to some of the challenges we have in our world today. So the overview of this presentation is I'll give you a quick introduction, a little bit of background to myself, won't be too long on that, but to give you an understanding of the definition of sustainable timber, talk about forests and the challenges and issues in forests. I'm going to be talking about why I feel so strongly about using Australian timber. I'll be talking about some of the issues associated with that. And then I hope to leave you with some solutions and some tips for the future. So I would like to start off, as Simon did, in recognising the traditional people. In my case, it's the local clans in Brisbane who are the Turrbal and Jagera people. And I'd like to acknowledge all elders, past and present, and I'm working towards a community with them whereby justice, awareness and equity of a sustainable environment for future generations will be achieved. So my story briefly is in 2000, as an architect, having then about 10 years in practice, I built my own sustainable home. And this was my attempt to put many of my own personal principles into place. And I wish I'd done it 10 years earlier, because I realised the process of building your own home is probably one of the most informative and educational processes that one could ever go through. In 2000, and understand this is now 20 years ago, it was as challenging then as perhaps it is now to build a sustainable home. But material choice is always one of the first things to consider. And by looking around at sustainable materials, I found that timber was something hard to go past. So effectively, this home is a engineered timber, literally single skin Queensland, based on a traditional Queensland construction. And it is plywood, literally inside and out. And it was a home that my family and I lived in for about just on 10 years. And I'm happy to tell you that it was a wonderful experience, both to design and build something that you can live in yourself, but also it makes you realise what some of the challenges are of building, and also from a designer's point of view, a lot of things that we do for our clients. This gave me the experience of realising how important it is to get things like budget and material choice and selection right, because I had to live with it myself. What was unique about the building at the time was it was largely prefabricated. So the top right-hand slide shows you my house laid out in a shed in Brisbane. And it was panelised using the Guitar building system, which is a system that Michael Leo, a builder here in Brisbane, developed, and he and I collaborated on this project to come up with what ended up being a great end result. As you can see from these slides, it was panelised, put on the back of a truck and assembled on site. But for me, this was not only a fantastic experience, but this was the opportunity for me to test myself in the profession. I'm very pleased to say that I was successful in getting 3 architectural awards for this project, including the one I'm probably quite proud of, which is the Career Mail's People's Choice Award, which is testimony to the fact of the other awards were voted for by my peers, but the Career Mail's award was voted for by the general public. And to me, this was a really good, I guess, boost my confidence that sustainable housing is here to stay. I've spent the last 20 years promoting and building sustainable housing, but I still find it almost as hard as I did 20 years ago. And I'll talk about that a little bit as I go on. Interestingly, the slide at the bottom is the house today. I've become quite friendly with the current owners of the house. So I regularly go back and see how the place is going. And I'm incredibly proud at how the place is holding out 20 years later, albeit you will notice that it's changed colour, which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. From that particular project, I was successful in picking up 1 or 2 other projects. This was a commercial project using a very similar system in terms of a very low-tech method of assembling plywood walls and a solid plywood building. This was the Logan Administration building, which again is a relatively small building, but it was perfect to practice many of the sustainable principles that I had on my house and look at, again, building efficiently and building very cost effectively. I then moved on 10 years later to get a little bit closer to town because my first home was sort of out in the perimeter of Brisbane, and I've moved closer to Brisbane to decrease my environmental footprint. Some of the lessons I learnt in building the second house, of which this is, this was a refurbishment and addition to an old Queenslander. But between both houses, a couple of key things I learnt working with timber is that people will tell you what they think you want to hear. Often when you're quizzing people on really important information, they very quickly turn around to give you answers to what they think you want to hear. And often what you're told is not totally correct. And I say again, when you're working for yourself or doing your own project, you really take a very different opinion as to the information you're getting. And I learnt and have learnt right through my career that you must investigate yourself. You must be informed and you must continue to stay informed because often information changes. And one of the biggest challenges of working with timber is making sure that you're aware of the maintenance factors. Another lesson I had was with timber furniture selection. And the chairs in this slide, and in fact the unit at the back, were peddled to me initially as totally sustainable timber solutions. It wasn't until I really investigated that they were sustainable. But one of the units that I nearly bought, which was a recycled teak unit, when I looked into its credentials, I realised that there were a number of loopholes around to say that recycled teak could have 10 to 20% of new teak in it, and likely that new teak was coming from a Asian rainforest. So these are the sorts of things that not just in furniture, but the same information comes through often in the retail and wholesale industry. As I said, the main difference 20 years later to this house is that it's been completely repainted, and the lesson of how to maintain your timber buildings is something that I'm very conscious of, and I'll share with you that this is such an important thing to ensure that your designs and your buildings are sustainable in the future, because the ease of which you can maintain timber is a really important attribute in using timber. So it is important to understand that timber is a natural and cellular, and it moves with change in climatic conditions. It is prone to rot, mould and fungi. Most often it's going to be treated. So it's important from a sustainable timber point of view and from an environmental point of view, you understand the treatments that are going into the timber. And many timbers are actually treated before you get them on site. So it's important to understand not only what species, but also what treatments particular timber species. I don't need to tell you that timbers tend to silver or look old if left natural. Sometimes that's the desired look, but most clients I've been working with over the years want to have timber that looks like it looked the day it was installed. One of the challenges for us all now moving forward is climate change and biodiversity. So it's dear to my heart, the builders declare and architects declare activities to actually find ways to deal with the changing issues on our planet. Of course, the real question is, what can I do and what sort of difference can I make? And I found these quite interesting because initially we would sort of assure people that everything was okay, it's business as usual, but then the messages have changed recently. So it's not business as usual, but now business as usual is not even an option. So if you're serious about taking a strong stand with the Builders Declare initiatives, I really encourage you that you can do a lot, but you must know that you have to change to make the change happen. That there's a tendency in Australia to think that somebody else is going to do something, but you as an individual have to start making those changes. And interestingly, sustainability messages are not as powerful as they have been in the past. And sustainability alone isn't driving short-term behaviour, and the consumers would much rather spend money on things that look good. It's really important that we all understand that corporate industry at the moment is meeting consumer demands. But the good thing is that the larger corporates are certainly changing because brand awareness and reputation is very important for them. And we're finding more and more that working through the industry, we're seeing sustainable initiatives really starting to come through. So what is then sustainable timber? Well, whenever I get asked to talk about something, I try to make sure that I'm clear and make it very clear to everybody what we're talking about. So Google defines sustainable timber that is timber that has been harvested responsibly from well-managed forests, that are those forests are continuously replenished, and that sustainable timber practices ensure that there's no damage to the surrounding environment or to native fauna and flora. So that's a pretty interesting definition and a pretty challenging definition if you understand that timber needs to come from sustainable sources. And as I said earlier on, why Australian timber? I'm a great proponent of using local timber because I believe it's an incredible way to participate in a circular economy approach. I believe Australian timber supports regional communities. And I'm happy to say this because the regulations we have in Australia are probably amongst the tightest in the world when it comes to forest management. So there's a lot to be said about working with local people who are working under usually pretty stringent conditions. We all know that there have been issues with forests and forest management in the past, but the environmental performance of the Australian timber industry and forestry industry has improved dramatically. The standards that we use here in Australia have been set for Australian conditions, and within the industry more broadly, we're seeing a much greater awareness and acceptance of the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And of course, it obviously makes sense to carbon, which is the essence of timber, we should be keeping it where it should be, which is one of the reasons that I am very keen to support Australian timber is, again, from environmental reasons, that transportation is one of the areas that there is a huge amount of greenhouse gas associated with it. And recently, and certainly since COVID, we're finding that there's a lot more emphasis being placed to shipping, which currently represents about 3.1% of greenhouse gas emissions. But by 2050, it's expected that that could increase to about 10%. So just being clear about reducing transportation of products and materials is going to go a long way to reduce one's carbon footprint. The other thing, as I said, is that the code of practice for timber, and in fact the rules and regulations of timber in Australia, are quite stringent. And in the preparation of this presentation, I was actually quite amazed at just how many restrictions there are placed on loggers in particular. There's all sorts of criteria on what they need to do when they're logging, protection of waterways, making sure that they understand the slopes they're working on. And we often hear and see the worst in terms of logging practices. And it's important to understand that there are still poor practices out there, but all in all, the Australian forestry industry is highly regulated and works to best practice principles in areas that it is in control of. And that's a really important point to understand in the areas that it is in control of. And it's important to understand that there have been environmental issues associated with the timber industry, and of course some of those are being addressed at the moment in an ecosystem decline inquiry in Victoria, set up as recently as last month. But over the years there have been a number of improvements and developments in terms of how timber can be sourced and released into the marketplace. So I go through this because I think it's pretty important to have a background understanding of what we're actually dealing with the Australian timber industry. And I guess something I wasn't aware of is that a koala, if it's killed, if you are caught killing a koala in particular, which is one of the species that loggers are often guilty of disturbing or even accidentally killing, there's a $22,000 fine, and that's for the illegal killing, and those fines are enough to actually hurt incredibly a small logging practice. So it's important to understand these fines are quite effective in terms of making a difference. Another thing I've heard about logging practices is that night logging is just a greedy way to get more timber. But I've found through my research that night logging is actually one of the methods used to ensure that they can spot wildlife of the night. So over the years, and certainly since I've been a director of Responsible Wood, which is now for 3 years, and I'm a volunteer director, so I'm able to say that I'm independent, because my role here is to assist in the development of many of the codes and practices and standards within the industry. But I think it's important to understand that forest harvesting isn't pretty. And these shots are from a Victorian forest taken some time ago. But it's important to understand that this is a point in time. And interestingly, I have some shots here of some logging work, again, I believe, done many years ago at Picton in this particular instance. This was a harvest in 1988. This is what it looked like 5 years later. And this is what it looked like 17 years later. And certainly, as the person who shared this information with me said, it started to become difficult to work out that you were taking the photo from the same place because of the healthy regrowth. And interestingly, the original picture was used in the Wilderness Society anti-forestry campaigns. And certainly when we continue to see images of destruction like that, it really paints a picture that things are going wrong. But in actual fact, through sustainable forest management, we're actually able to deliver some timber. So an opinion that I picked up and I've actually had recounted to me many times is that Australia has one of the best forest management systems in the world. And as little as 6% of Australia's 147 million hectares of native forest is public forest, and timber is only harvested from about 1% of these forests each year. So that's not to say that we still don't have some challenges, but most of those challenges are happening on private property, some of which is outside the timber industry, but anything that is directly associated with the supply of timber through certified and accredited sources is very heavily regulated. I guess the other reason I'm particularly keen to see Australian timber used is that it's important that it is seen as an employment enabler for Australians. I've come to understand, as many of you probably have too, that particularly since COVID, the concept of bringing things from all over the world to Australia doesn't always make the most sense. So we need to be developing our own industries and making sure that we make them as appropriate and as sustainable for us in our own communities. Now, in the research I've done for this, I've gone to some trouble to find what I believe are the latest sources of what the forestry situation is globally at the moment. And unfortunately, it's not a good story. But those stories continue, and it's up to us and the demands and the leadership we take to actually start changing some of this behaviour and activity. So forest certification schemes, of which there are two predominant global ones, which are FFC and PEFC, you can see from this map that they cover a large percentage of the world. But again, it's important to understand and make sure your facts are right, because if you compare that to the earlier map, you'll see that the representation of areas covered is actually based on countries in this particular map. And one of the things that really disturbs me as somebody in the industry is that only 10% of the forests worldwide are actually certified forests. But one of the problems that exist globally at the moment is that we have activities happening in these major parts of the world which are largely unregulated. And this again is the reason that we need to be ensuring that we're using timber that comes from certified sources, which is regulated, because anything that you buy that is not regulated, you really can't say that you're not contributing to the problem. And I have a few slides here, and these are a few years old, but it gives you an idea of what the size of the forest industry is in Australia and the breakup of states. Interestingly, as a Queenslander, you can see that Queensland has the most forest area in the country, and Tasmania, that gets probably the greatest exposure about forestry, has one of the smallest areas. The percentage of forest, no matter what forest we're talking about, all forests are important. And it's also important to understand the way forests are broken up and the descriptions of forests. So native forests by crown cover represent only a percentage of the forests in Australia. You can see these maps and this information, which will be available to you if you want to get into it, gives you an idea of the amount of forestry which is in leasehold. Generally, that leasehold land is often controlled by the industry, but not always. You'll see that Crown land and conservation reserve land makes up probably quite a considerable area of the forests that we have in Australia. Interestingly, plantations, which is the other source of sustainable timber, again, they're distributed pretty well around the state, but they're a much smaller percentage and number of the forested areas in Australia. So this map, which is probably the most credible map in terms of all sources that I've come across, gives you an understanding of what we're dealing with in Australia at the moment, and the fact that you don't have to be Einstein to realise that the forestry is centred around the coast. That's where the population is, and of course that's where most of the pressures are on this limited but hopefully sustainable source for our future. So I've mentioned that forest certification is important, and forest products ideally need to be certified to demonstrate that they've come from a sustainable source. And certification actually means that the forests and the practices associated with bringing from the forest have been checked at or looked at from a harvesting point of view and audited. And this work is actually done under the Australian Forestry Certification Scheme or Forest Stewardship Council. So these are the two predominant programs in Australia. Australian Forest Certification Scheme is the act the Australian government follows. And there is a total of 10.5 million hectares of native forests and plantations which are certified under these standards. But the standards and the criteria for sustainable forest management, of which these forests are operated on, don't just need to talk about sort of biodiversity issues, but there is a whole criteria that one must be audited against to ensure that the sustainable forest management practices are undertaken. So you can see the list here of maintenance of a productive capacity of forest ecosystems, maintenance of the ecosystem health and vitality, and ensuring that the maintenance of soil and water resources are retained. So through my experience with talking to people in the industry, I've seen some amazing examples where forests are actually managed, and I've also seen a number of areas which are not managed particularly well because generally they're outside of the certification system. So one of the key messages I want to put across in this presentation is that to be truly sustainable and responsible, you must make sure that you're getting certified timber, because it's the only responsible way to ensure that you are getting what you hopefully are wanting by using sustainable timber. And here in Australia, certification under the Australian Forest Standard Systems is achieved by three key things: that the products must originate from a sustainably managed forest, that the product is of 100% legal origin, and I'm sure you're all aware that there have been many issues in the past with illegal logging, and now we're dealing with a whole lot of fair trade issues and everything in relation, or we have for many years. But again, certified timber is addressing these issues, and the tracking system, which we call chain of custody, is the method in which we validate all claims of origin, and this is a system which is audited and monitored to ensure that we do actually get what we're paying for or what we want. Now, there is a system whereby if claims are not claims aren't approved, there is a whole system in going back and checking. So this is a system that is ensuring that best practice happens now and continues to happen, but it does in the past, or has in the past, led to some practices that have been less than ideal. But as the system improves, it is, and over time, and particularly in the last 10 and 20 years, the practices are best practice and world leading. The PEFC is the global certification system, along with FFC, Forest Stewardship Certification System. These are the two global certification systems that apply, and Responsible Wood works under the PEFC criteria. One of the great things that I've seen with the PEFC program is that it's relying on working with people in the forest. It's what I call a bottom-up approach. Some of the other certification systems are very dictatorial and say you must do this, whereas the PEFC programs allow for people to improve and make sure that they come up to the standard, and they will not get certified until the standard is achieved. One of the programs that PEFC has developed in 2018 is to start recognising trees outside forests. So we talk predominantly about trees in forests as the major source of timber, but as time goes on, we're going to see and we're going to need many other sources of timber. So it's great that certification is going to be something that can cover not just forest areas. More recently, there's been a lot of discussion about which is a better scheme, FFC or PEFC. And I personally don't like to get into those sorts of discussions, because even though I'm associated with Responsible Wood, I believe the issue is we should be using certified timber. And if you're using FFC or PEFC, that is the only way that you will know that the timber is certified. You hear different things in the industry about one is absolutely better than the other, but we're starting to get information to say that both schemes, albeit they're different and they have differing of assessing, but they actually are deemed equivalent in many areas. And it's an important thing to understand that certification is the key issue, not which particular type of certification. So again, the certification that both FFC and PEFC need to look at basically align with the sustainable development principles and practices that are now being promoted by the United Nations. So it's not just making sure that the timber is a particular type, but it's actually looking at all of the ecological issues associated, looking at economic factors as well as fair rights, land rights, etc. So there are multiple things that we now know are being addressed when we're using certified timber. If we're sourcing timber that is not certified, we have no understanding at all as to whether the timber is either legal or whether it should be used by us full stop. A number of years ago, the Green Building Council weighed in on the equation and also recognised that the two predominant certification systems, FFC, pardon me, and PEFC, are the two schemes that they recognise as the way to achieve sustainable timber. And as I've personally been involved with the Green Building Council since its inception, I've seen the rigour and the technical investigations they make to ensure that they're achieving best practice. So I share this with you to give you an understanding that when you do use certified timber, you can have some certainty that you are making sure that you are following a good environmental choice which addresses climate change issues and biodiversity. Now, moving on to another phase of this presentation, which is to talk about good wood guides. So it's great, and certainly in my home and in all of the projects that I like to work on, I always like to check the guides that are out there to get the latest information and to see what differing opinions are in terms of species and availability of things. So I just put up a range of guides that I've seen and I know are out in the marketplace. And I think it's important to inform yourself. Certainly 20 years ago, the Rainforest Information Centre guide was something I paid a lot of attention to. But now we have excellent guides like the Ceres Fair Wood Guide. But there are many ways that you need to use these guides, and one of the most important things that you need to understand is what is available in your local area. Because often these guides you'll find will actually steer you to solutions that may be either rather expensive or may actually bring timber in from other parts of the world without you knowing. So again, it's important to be asking for Australian timber and certified timber. I think most of these guides would generally agree with that. But as I said in the outset of this presentation, it's really important to make sure that you drill people and make sure you're actually getting what you believe you're getting. Probably as a general guide, one of the best third-party documents I've come across that talks about environmental issues with timber and the types of use of timber in buildings is the Ecospecifier guide. This is available and the link is there. And I really recommend this to architects, builders and to clients to get a really good overview of the sorts of issues which deal with what are the certification methods, what does chain of custody mean, and gives you an understanding of carbon sink benefits of different timber products. Again, one of the challenges with the internet these days is there's so much information available. I think it's important that you actually always can go to credible sources to get the correct information. The other thing that we're seeing is the industry coming forward with a whole lot of campaigns, again, to promote timber and the use of timber, and in particular, the Make It Wood campaign and Wood Solutions have done an amazing job in terms of promoting the use of timber, which again, reading the fine print, is generally always certified timber. So it's important to make sure that the certification message is always loud and clear. Now, one of the challenges that we're going to see in the future is we're going to see a lot more green concrete, green steel, green other materials. But it's important to understand that consumers and hopefully the industry really knows that timber remains the most environmentally friendly material, and also the highest way, or one of the higher ways, practically and cost effectively to store carbon. But as I've said before, sustainability is not always the dominant decision maker. Durability, occupant satisfaction, and aesthetics seem to be the key things that people are looking for, and it's because of this that often people are encouraged to use timbers which either come from overseas or are not certified. And the challenge for us moving forward, particularly in the declare movements and the activities, is to make sure that we're very clear that we are using timber on all of our projects that is able to be validated. And I guess we do have the support that most Australians support habitat restoration and growing more trees. And so I can now, through my investigations, ensure you that the Australian forestry industry is actually replanting and making sure that the industry is sustainable, because it doesn't make sense to be providing a material that you're not going to have enough of in the future. So the latest campaigns done by Wood Solutions have indicated that around 3/4 of Australians agree that timber is the ultimate renewable message, that wood is loved above other materials. However, people value forests for their contribution for the environment and wildlife. And so it's interesting that as architects and builders, and we get a really good understanding that when we're putting forward sustainable timber, as in certified timber, you have some confidence that the best practices that we can achieve are being applied through the industry when the timber is certified. I'd like to just share with you, I mentioned before about information and mapping. With the recent fires that we had in Australia, you could look at different maps, and this map on the lower right would make you think that the whole world has been burning. The way maps are represented and the information on maps is really important to analyse and understand. So according to the map on the right, you'll see that all of Australia is burnt out. But in actual fact, when you look at the list of countries on that particular map, Australia doesn't even feature. So the point I'm wanting to make here is that we continually get information from the media, from various sources that sort of make things much more dramatic than they actually are. And we're all interested in seeing natural forests and native forests that are well managed. Now, the other challenge that we have is making sure that our suppliers, our retailers and our wholesalers are actually doing the right thing, so that these are the people that we work with. Now, the great news is that Bunnings, who I don't need to introduce to anybody, have gone a long way to committing to responsible timber sourcing, and that they have goals, and it's important to understand these are goals, and that by December 2020, which is passed, all the timber and all of the products originate from natural forests with third-party certification. Now, interestingly, what they're talking about here is generally the timber, not necessarily all the products. So if you go in and buy, for example, a table and chair setting, there's a pretty good chance that you'll need to check the source of that it is certified, because a lot of these things that we read about are goals, and they're still actually being put in place. I guess this is really telltale to me when you look further on the Bunnings website and you realise that only 40% of the products that are sold through Bunnings are sourced from businesses who manufacture in Australia and New Zealand. So that means 60% of the product coming in is coming in from overseas. And if you understand that 10% of forests around the world are certified, you don't have to be Einstein to realise that much of the product still coming in is coming in from questionable sources. Now, the certification schemes, PEFC and FFC, are being used in a greater way, but in actual fact, we're still seeing a lot of timber coming from unsubstantiated sources. So I stress again, it's important to actually talk to people at Bunnings and to follow through to actually make sure that the paperwork and the certification is actually available with the product and the materials that you are sourcing. And on the positive side of things, Bunnings are actually now in many of their product ranges identifying that the features of timber and timber products are that they're responsible wood, PEFC or chain of custody certified. So this is a great indication of how the industry and the retailers are moving in the right direction, but I've found that you have to keep asking the questions to ensure that you're actually getting this correct product. Now, the future of timber in Australia is going to change because we do have a shortage. As we keep growing, we're finding that more and more there's great pressure on forests, and so plantations, which we don't actually have enough of, but these will be one of the major sources of timber for the future. And so the engineered timber ranges and the promotion of CLT, plywood, and all the various engineered timbers will be the predominant stock of sustainable timber for us in the future. We're going to have to get smart in how we use timber, because we're not going to have the same options that we've had before about just going in and grabbing very long pieces of solid timber. Little plug for our sponsor. Hyne have actually been at the lead of pine timber, and many of the roof truss systems and everything you'll see and perhaps are using at the moment come from Australian sustainable sources. But of course, the climate challenge that we have, and certainly the fires that we experienced in Australia last year, have continued to put additional pressure on timber and in fact other materials for building. I'm happy to report to you, and you may or may not know, that much, not all of it, but much of the timber that was burnt in the managed forests, both native forests and plantation forests, within a year has been able to be saved. I don't know the exact figure off the top of my head, but after the fires, people see devastation. But the great thing about timber as a material is that it's still possible to go in and to claim what is burnt timber, but it's still quite usable timber. And this is one of the amazing qualities that timber has over other materials that we use in buildings. But our challenge is to be supporting and to ensure that we have this industry and this material available to us in the future. And understanding and participating in industry campaigns on how we can use these products is going to be important. I'd like to start finishing up because I'm conscious of time, and share with you some of the approaches that I'm adopting and others are adopting in terms of the way we use timber. And one practice, which is designed for deconstruction, here identified by architectus at the Macquarie University, shows that the use of timber is actually considered in a way so that it can actually be disassembled and reused elsewhere. And I believe that the way we build timber now and in the future will need to start to adopt these practices. It's not quite the same as conventional building, and we as designers, as architects, are going to have to think differently. So we need to minimize building design used in buildings. We need to be thinking about simpler connections and making them visible so that they lend themselves to design for deconstruction. And the composite materials, which I call effectively materials waiting for landfill. Many of these composite panels you see, but I don't know anybody locally who's actively recycling those sorts of materials. So I think it's really important to, again, really inform yourself of the product suppliers are putting out there.
Mark, just to let you know, it is 6 p.m. Your internet just broke up a little bit there towards the end, and there's certainly some questions I want to get through. So
I'll just finish up shortly. So as I said, design for deconstruction deconstruction is really an approach, one of the solutions for the future. The industry through Wood Solutions has great information to help you with detailing and finishes. Just if you do come across any instances where you think forests are not managed correctly and they're actually certified forests, please contact either FFC or Responsible Wood and see if you can get to the bottom of what's going on. My solutions for the future are basically to use more local timber. Used correctly, it's carbon storage, not carbon pollution. I believe that reclaimed timber is obviously the best, and design for deconstruction is going to, again, please make sure it's certified. Timber needs to be designed correctly and well utilised. Engineered timber is going to be the way of the future, and it's a lot more sustainable, notwithstanding what you might hear from other industries. I think it's really critical that we don't pollute with timber and that we keep the treatments and the toxicity issues front of mind and make sure that we factor that into our design and building. And that I hope in the future you and I will never throw out a piece of timber, but it will always be positioned for recycling. My take-home concepts for the Builders Declare movement is that Australian timber is generally well managed, that native forest logging is an essential part of our sustainable future. Forest plantations are part of the solution, but native forests will be another part of the solution. Timber use is going to be essential for our low carbon future, and that recycling and reusing timber should become a national human power in buying and to inform yourself. So thanks, Simon. That pretty well wraps it up. I hope, although it's a very general presentation, it's been quite deliberate to sort of cover a bit of ground. So over to you, Simon.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you, Mark. Great takeaways, and there's certainly some light at the end of the tunnel, and the industry seems to be going in the right direction. There's a heap of questions here. Guys, I'm going to try and get through.
Perfect, but
you all right there, Mark? Can
yes.
you hear me? Yep. So
yes,
we'll spend the next 10 or 15 minutes, 6:15, we'll cut it off there. We'll get through as many questions as we can. Mark, got a question here regarding biodiversity. It seemed to come up a few times. Do you feel that the biodiversity, from Gillian, this question is maintained in planted forests across the world, or is there a risk of single species?
I believe that with certified forests, the biodiversity issue is taken very seriously. So I don't apologise for using the word certified so many times, because if you are not using timber from a certified source, you have no guarantee that biodiversity will be protected. So I stress that the only way that you can participate in ensuring that biodiversity is upheld and kept is to use certified timber. And Australian certified timber practices are as at least equal, if not the best in the world. And that's the other reason why I feel very strongly about Australian timber being used.
Okay. Got a question here.
Does that answer the question, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. Yep. Got a question here well, they're all related, but in preparing for the future and future-proofing the timber industry in a sustainable way, are we prepared? Is Australia prepared for the rapid growth, in projected stock levels and our housing growth that we predict?
The answer, just saw that my connection was a bit fuzzy then. So Can you hear me at the moment, Simon?
Yeah, I can. Yep.
Yeah, look, one of the biggest challenges that not just we in Australia, but the world has, is how we're going to manage our growth in the future. But my answer to that is that we're not just going to stop everything overnight. So we've got to start changing dramatically and start using sustainable materials. And timber is one of those sustainable materials. More really understand what's going on, the better off we're going to be. Now, the flip side of that is if you stop using timber, you're going to be using other materials which are going to have a much greater impact. So, and again, as time goes on, we'll all be using recycled and reprocessed materials. But again, the challenge is keeping the embodied energy and the the energy cost of that recycling process down. And that's the reason that I believe we need to keep this local and not be bringing materials in from other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, Mark, approximately what percentage of the Australian timber products that we use in Australia come from certified Australian forests? You got any idea there?
I'll take that on notice. I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm probably going to share with you it's probably not as high as we'd like it to be. And the reason that is that we don't have the regulations in Australia. We have very tight regulations for the timber that we grow here. But that same rigor in from overseas, and again, without sounding too repetitive, it has to be certified. If it's not certified, you've got no idea of what you're using. So, in the last 20 years, all of the products that I used in my house, I could find certified products 20 years ago. The situation's improved dramatically since, but I continue to see timber retailers and wholesalers bringing product in from overseas, which is questionable in its source.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, why is there a timber shortage at present and with increased pricing? Is it perception to increase market value, or is it just the COVID phenomenon, or what do you put it to?
It's a combination of both. There is actually the thing that's exacerbated the situation is COVID. And when you understand that a lot of our forests are tied up in existing contracts at the moment, so we do need to, by creating a stronger local market, we will actually get a much greater percentage of the local product. But because we haven't been diligent over the years and we've let our guards down, we've allowed a whole lot of people to bring overseas products in, and that's something that needs to change.
Okay. A couple more challenging questions here. Why are Vic forests often in courts accused of improperly harvesting timber from our state forests? Can you comment on that at all?
I'm a Queenslander, so I can't directly comment on that, but I'm obviously in touch with a lot of commentary about what's happening. And I guess what I'm hearing at the moment is that the court issues are not resolved, so it's not appropriate to talk about it. But at the same time, I understand that there have been some very minor breaches which are being turned into massive issues. So this is where I think it's really important not to read the front page of the paper, to start making your own plays, and certainly the information that I'm getting, benefit of having a managed system with audits and everything is that you'll ensure that the right thing is done.
Is the logging in Victoria generally done by state? Is it state owned?
It's a combination of both, and some of the figures which I don't have in front of me at the moment shows the breakdown of areas that have leasehold. Some of those are private, And so one of the biggest issues that you come across all the time is that the worst practices are generally happening on private land, state government land, and area monitored. And if there are non-compliances, they get audited, they get trawled through the process, and they get fined. So I'm not here to tell you that it's a perfect system, but we do have a system, a best practice system, to ensure that any practices like that do not occur again.
Mm-hmm. We'll go one or two more questions. This is one that sort of bugged me. Been hearing it for 15 years. So Merbau, it's obviously got a really bad rep, but is it yet sustainable? Is it yet?
Yep.
It is.
Look, some of it is, and the great news is that there are sustainable plantations which are both being planted at the moment. But at the moment, a lot of the Merbau is coming out of forests, which are questionable. If they have been certified by either FFC or PEFC, you've got a pretty good chance that it will be well managed. But if it's not, watch out. And as you've heard me say, every time you buy Merbau, you need to check that it's certified. You need to get that evidence. If you do not get that evidence, I can almost guarantee you're assisting in the destruction of the rainforest somewhere.
Mm-hmm. So it's pretty simple. Don't buy timber without a certification.
Absolutely. I hear from time to time that, people complain about the certification schemes. They should be better. Can I tell you that without the certification schemes, our planet is doomed, basically. So you have to work with what's out there at the moment. What's out there at the moment is being improved through continuous practice processes. And the reason, as what I call myself a sustainable architect, the reason I've become so involved in this is because I'm understanding what the real situation is, and we have to use certified timber. There's no question about it. There are some local programs which are interesting, but again, they should be working towards certification, because certification is the only way credibly that anybody can be absolutely certain and to ensure that their reputation is held. If you're a practicing commercial architect, I think if you're not using certified timber, you're actually running reputational risk. So I feel very strongly about this, and I hear a lot of stories out there that it's not available and all a lot of rubbish. It's a case of you've got to make sure you get what you ask for.
Yep. And so you have full confidence in the certification process?
It's one of the reasons I don't get paid, I'm a volunteer director. It's one of the reasons I got involved in this activity, because I'd heard so much in the industry about what was wrong. So I figured that I need to actually go and find out myself. I've got involved in it, and I'm happy to tell you that it's not perfect, but at the same time, I'd much rather be with the side that's making great progress as opposed to contributing to the problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good to know. Good to know. All right, well, let's leave it there. Awesome to have you on, Mark. Really appreciate that. So thanks to Mark and to Hyne Timber for making this event possible. This event has been recorded and it will be on the Builders Declare YouTube. We are YouTubers. Hyne, everyone, please also check out Hyne's website. They do have some great information. They have information on timber, why we should use timber for our projects, sustainability, chain of custody, and environmental impacts. They also have free downloads that could be really valuable. Software to help design structural timber elements. So there's a sustainability ebook, and you can even download the timber mill monitoring data. So go to www.hyne.com.au. And remember, we'll be back on May the 12th with Brian Gunnan on weather-resistant barriers for high-performing homes. And once again, if you'd like to know more about how you can help Builders Declare, create this website and resource to make the Australian building industry the most sustainable building industry in the world, please do get in touch. Our email is info@buildersdeclare.com.au. We're on Facebook. There's a Facebook group, Instagram, all those good places. So that's all from us. Thanks again, Mark, and we'll see you all in May. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Simon.
Cheers.